Thanks everybody for being here. I want to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Michael Arena. He's been the Chief Talent Officer at General Motors since 2012. He's responsible for enterprise talent management, strategic workforce analytics, talent acquisition, executive development, and global learning for 200,000 General Motor employees across the globe. Prior to joining GM, Dr. Arena served as Senior Vice President of Leadership Development for Bank of America's Global Consumer and Small Business Banking Group. He spent 2 years as a visiting scientist within the MIT Technology Media Lab, and he's also currently a lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania and the D School at Stanford, so a lot of accolades here. He is also the author of a new book released in June of this year called Adaptive Space: How GM and other companies are disrupting themselves and transforming themselves into agile organizations. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Arena.
Thanks, Adam. Thank you. Well, good morning on this snowy day, right? So if you're like me, your muscle memory hasn't kicked in, and as soon as you saw snow on your vehicle, you're like, oh, crud, this is coming. So I think we've got a few stragglers coming in a little bit late because of the snow and the weather, but I'm thrilled to be here. And we've been talking about this for a while. Finally, we're able to make it happen. And I want to talk a little bit about networks. So the title of the presentation this morning is Transforming Organizations, or Transforming into Agile Organizations. But what I really want to talk about behind that are networks. And I know we've got a bunch of nonprofit folks in the room this morning. I know we've got a handful of students, and you can always tell the students because they sit in the back of the room or they sit at the edge, where they can depart quickly if this starts to become nonsensical. So, I just want to let you know we know you're there and we know where you're sitting. But I want to talk about networks. I want to spend a little bit of time talking really about the power of networks. Less so about corporations, although I have to share a little bit about General Motors, and I will, but more so about institutions as a whole, and even you as individuals. And how can you truly leverage the power of your network in order to get stuff done? So with that said, we're going to interact. I promise you're going to interact with me. We're going to engage a bit this morning. We'll get some energy flowing in the room. So let's just start a little bit with General Motors. So we live in the era of disruption. We live in a world where business and/or institutions and much of what we do is being disrupted on a daily basis. Mary Barra, when she stepped into the CEO role at General Motors just about 4 years ago, actually said that we will see more change in the automotive industry in the next 5 years than we have in the last 50. I would argue that about 2 years in, that was already true. I mean, just think about this for a moment. Uber is 7 years old. Now, we use Uber, as a descriptor of how we're going to get around today, and Uber is only 7 years old. It was actually 7 years ago, Uber just started to show up in places like San Francisco. Today, the combination of Uber and Lyft actually, I think it's 73% of business travel in the U.S. is dominated through Uber and Lyft. Anyone know what happened to taxi cabs in that same time frame? They're virtually unseen, literally virtually unseen, unless you go to some place, like the last stronghold, like Manhattan. You can see that just in 5 years, this world of mobility has really, truly transformed. And yet, we need to think about organizations differently. And I can run through this. And the reason we know mobility, the reason we know transportation is being disrupted is because you've got all these new entrants. Google is playing in the automotive space. Apple is hiring more automotive experience engineers. Automotive experience engineer is the exact title of the job that they're hiring right now. And no one really knows why, right? They're up to something. And then, Intel spent $15 billion just about a year ago on a company called Mobileye, which essentially does nothing but provide camera and sensor technologies to the automotive industry. So you can begin to see that, the world's about ready to be disrupted here in the automotive industry, and yet, you've got traditional players who have pretty much operated the same way they have in the past. So, what I want to talk about is this concept of becoming agile this concept of tapping into the power of your network to become agile and how we need to disrupt the way we work as a whole. And to do that, I guess I'm going to have to walk over on this side because I'm too far away from the control. There it is. To do that, I need to talk a little bit about some research, and I promise not to, this will be my only research slide. But I need to talk a little bit about, some research that we conducted, really across the last decade. I was part of a research team. You could tell, based on my introduction that I spent time in business, a little bit of time in academia, and we were interested in this question as to why some organizations are adaptive and others aren't. And most notably, we went out and studied a bunch of large companies, and then later we actually did study some nonprofits, and we studied some smaller companies and even startups. And we were interested in why someone like Netflix, can continue to reinvent themselves so quickly. If you think about Netflix for a moment, think about Netflix as an institution. Netflix came out as a direct DVD mailing service. They already knew at the moment that they were mailing DVDs and competing against Blockbuster. When's the last time you saw a Blockbuster store, by the way? That's the opposite side of this. But Netflix already knew before they had introduced, a physical DVD by mail service, that the next wave of technology was going to be, live downstreams, live, streaming content across the internet. They just knew that whenever they introduced direct mail DVDs, that the technology hadn't quite caught up. So they were already planning for their own demise from the very beginning. Not only that, they quickly knew once they got to streaming that the content was going to become the problem, because the owners of the content, the recording studios that owned the content, were ultimately going to charge more and more of a premium. So they were already beginning to change their whole business model to move into the produced content, self-generated content. And you now know Netflix, their real bread and butter is what they're doing with producing their own content online. But that all started with physical DVDs that they knew wouldn't last for long. In fact, they actually got a lot of kickback from the consumer whenever they tried to migrate away from it too quickly. So when you think about it this way, there are organizations that can be really entrepreneurial, and there are other organizations that cling on, that hold on. Blockbuster is the opposite side of that story, right? Blockbuster had all the physical assets in the world. They had a retail genius running the organization. The problem is they didn't see the wave of activity that you saw on the previous slide sort of jumping into their market, and they didn't respond fast enough. I want to argue, and the reason I want to share this is I want to argue that that's a network problem as much as it is an organizational problem. And the research found that. Fact is, it's a social issue as much as anything else. And I'm going to share just a couple little stories before I get into your networks and engage you. And this is one story of the research case. We went out and interviewed 500 people, looked comprehensively at 60 companies. This was one organization. This was an organization that was acquiring another organization. This is a network of individuals. You can see two different organizations here. The pink dots or red dots was a large company that had acquired a smaller company down here in the blue dots. About 6 months in, none of these folks were talking to each other. About 6 folks in fact, the only people that were talking to each other inside this little bubble were required to talk to each other because they were part of the integration team. And reality is, this group was saying, why in the world did we buy this thing? It's not producing anything that we thought it was going to produce, which was, entrepreneur, innovative, sort of new ideas. And then the smaller organization, what do you think they were saying at this point? Anyone? What do you think they were saying about the bigger organization? They're stifling us. They're killing us. They're killing our mojo. And reality is, that is exactly what was happening. Then something amazing happened. And this was learned by mistake by us as we went out and started mapping out these organizations. Something really surprising happened for us. Remember that operational system? This represents that operational system. Remember those entrepreneurial pockets? That's what this is. Every organization we studied had great entrepreneurial pockets or ideas. They just weren't able to actually get those ideas into the formal system. What happened here was literally there were a handful of really smart people down here. So while this was a failure, this integration seemed to be a failure, what wasn't a failure was they acquired at a very expensive premium, they acquired some very good talent. So they started to move that talent into the business. That network looks like this 9 months later. What do you think started to happen right away? Anyone? I'm not going to be rhetorical in my questions. You got to scream them out. Go ahead. What do you think happened? All of a sudden, the same innovations that they were looking for here that were sort of stifled out or partitioned off from the organization started to pop after they moved a handful of people inside the organization deeper inside. So the reality is, when it comes to how do you adapt like Netflix, how do you continually respond, how as a nonprofit do you think about new funding mechanisms, new campaigns, new programs? As a student, how do you think about keeping yourself creative? The reality is it's a social phenomenon. And that's exactly what we found. We found out that we think of this as being a human capital challenge. We got to hire really, really smart people, and that's only part of the battle. What we also have to do is we have to position those people for tremendous success. So let me say it very simply, and I'm in the human capital space. I run talent for General Motors, so I'm constantly thinking about smart people and developing people, and that matters. I don't want to say that doesn't matter. Your education here matters a lot, but how you're positioned to use that education might matter as much as 40%. And that's what we have found in the new research is as much as 40% of your overall performance is predicated on how well positioned you are to leverage what you know as opposed to just what you know. So just hiring smart people is not enough. If they're partitioned off or marginalized, they can't really use what they know. So, and let me just make this real for a moment. Do you know any really, really smart people that whenever they have to be the smartest person in the room, they step into the room and, they have to have the best idea about everything and anything and all the time. And what do the people around them do? Now, none are in the room right now. I know that, right? So you don't have to point fingers. But what do? They make fun of them. They begin to marginalize them. Your eyes gloss over and you say, this too shall pass. Would this idiot please shut up soon? And all of a sudden you forget the words that are coming out of their mouth. The reality is really smart people marginalized, not positioned to be able to leverage what they know, isn't a successful recipe. And one of the problems we have in institutions is not thinking about social connections as much as we need to. So that's where I want to spend some time. What we found was with the adaptive organizations, is they had a third dimension. Every organization had these. Every organization had formal systems to get stuff done, but only the adaptive ones had something we call adaptive space, which is basically a better understanding of how to leverage their network. So that's the theory. That's the theory I wanted to share with you. Now I want to make it real. And to make it real, I got to make it fun. So let's just start with this. Who's this? What's he known for? Come on, Footloose, right? Wasn't he in Footloose? I said that to my son, and he says, Kevin Bacon wasn't in Footloose. And then I thought, oh my goodness, am I getting old? He actually did a cameo in the second Footloose, just by technicality. But what is Kevin Bacon known for? 6 degrees of separation. So the theory goes like this. Kevin Bacon is no farther removed from any living or deceased actor or actress any more than 6 degrees of separation. Why is that? By the way, that's not even true. 6 degrees is far too big, far too large of a degree of separation number. The actual number is 2.54. There are academics that have studied this, by the way. 2.54. But why is it? And you can prove this. I'm going to actually, you can go out and test this. It's open access data. There's actually something called the Oracle Bacon. If you're on your computer, you can Google it right now. Literally, you can type in any actor or actress, and it will give you a Bacon number. So I did that. I did that just because I wanted to prove. I didn't want to do it live because I didn't know if the internet connection would work. But, if you type in Lori Singer, turns out she had a bacon number of 1. They were in the same movie together. So I wanted to find someone else. So, okay, what about, George Clooney, a bacon number of 2. They actually have never been in a movie together, surprisingly enough. But I started typing in all kinds of other numbers like John Wayne and Marilyn Monroe, and I know I'm showing my age now for sure, but they always got a bacon number of about 2 to 3, back and forth, even if they've been dead for 30 years. So I decided to try to trick the software, and I said, well, what about Mickey Mouse? Turns out the software's smarter than me. It actually substituted Walt Disney for Mickey Mouse, and Walt Disney, who's been dead for years, has a bacon number of 3. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm fascinated by that. I had to get a bacon number of 4, I had to type in Rob Thomas, not the first, not Rob Thomas the second, not even Rob Thomas the third, but Rob Thomas the fourth, some strange micro actor in Australia, in order to get a bacon number of 4. Is that interesting to you? It's fascinating to me. Why is that? Anyone? Non-rhetorical again. Scream out. Why does Kevin Bacon have such a tight degree of separation number? Anyone? It's not typical. All the movies he's been in? Okay, what else? Scream out some more. His relationships, the size of his network? Okay, what else? Duration? He's been around forever, for goodness sakes, right? So duration has something to do with it. Go ahead. So a lot of really lousy movies. Yeah, we're not even saying Kevin Bacon is a good actor, right? Now, you may argue with that, but all those are partially true but incomplete. Here's the reality of it, and this is why it matters to you. And I'm going to prove why it matters to you with the real character and the real network. So this is hypothetical, but it's approximated. So there's Kevin Bacon in the center. There's another guy over on the right-hand side. Same number of connections. It has very little to do with the size of his overall network, by the way. That's Jim Carrey. Jim Carrey has been stuck in one genre his entire career, right? Kevin Bacon has crossed genres. So here's the real answer to your question. The real answer is, from a network standpoint, Kevin Bacon is a broker. A broker is someone who spans across many diverse populations of people, and that makes him indispensable for a handful of competitive advantages, but it also makes him central to a very broad ecosystem of networks, and that is different genres. He's been in everything from comedies to dramas to horror movies to, he was even the voice in Balto, and again, that's showing some of our ages if we understand who Balto is. But the reality is, Kevin Bacon, is a broker. Why does a broker matter? Why should you be thinking about whether or not you're a broker? Well, here's why. Here's why. Number one, a broker has 3 competitive advantages over the average person in the world. They have early access to new information, they have access to diverse information, and they have control over the dispersion of that information. So, and it turns out they get paid more, they get promoted more frequently, and they get hired more regularly than the average person in the world. Now I'm going to prove this to you. Now I want to make this real. So that's all true, but now I want to make it real inside of a business and/or institution level. Somebody else that we know was a broker. Someone else we know very well who was considered to be one of the most innovative people of our generation was also a broker, and that's Steve Jobs. Here's Steve Jobs' network. Steve Jobs' network actually looks a lot like Kevin Bacon's. This is patent data, real data, patent data inside of Apple, and this is data that basically shows how Steve Jobs was connected at the time, right, 2012, just prior to his death, his premature death. It shows how Steve Jobs was in fact connected as a broker, both inside. This shows inside data, but I've got outside data that also shows the same thing outside as it relates to Steve Jobs. So here's my argument. We think of Steve Jobs as being this brilliant, innovative, strategic, intuitive wizard in many regards. And those things may all be true, may have all been true. I want to argue that it was actually Steve Jobs' network that did much of the work for him. I want to argue that the reason Steve Jobs was all those things is because his network was doing much of that work for him. And that's the question I have for you to make this real is, are you bunkered down, clustered into a Jim Carrey-like network where everybody is connected to everybody else, which means everyone is thinking alike, which means that everyone acts alike, which means there are these social norms, and your ability to learn is diminished significantly? Or are you in a network, are you more of a broker like Steve Jobs? And the answer to that question, by the way, Jim Carrey's network position is very valuable for certain things, but it isn't for innovation. It isn't for gaining new ideas. What he would do very well is execute and deliver and bring things into the world. So that's why this matters to you. What kind of network do you have? Are you a central connector, or are you a Steve Jobs broker in regards to how you operate on a day-to-day basis? And chances are, at any given point in time, you're one or the other. And that's what I want to spend some time with. To do that, I want to talk about a handful of network principles. So now this is true outside of any corporation, and quite simply, there are things you can do to actually activate this. And some core social capital principles are quite simple. If you want to learn, go to the edge. If you want to learn like Steve Jobs, get outside of your bubble, get outside of your day-to-day interactions of people that you see who have a lot of what we call redundant ties, and go to the edge. And we'll talk more about that. If you want to bring something in the world, ideas are cheap. Learning new ideas is not enough. If you want to bring something into the world, go find a friend. I'll talk more about that. If you want to get that thing diffused into the world, follow the energy. Actually, conflict matters in a positive way at some stage in the process. And then if you're trying to get things formalized, and this can happen in any ecosystem or any outside network, as well as inside, try to close your network in on a person. And that's where I want to spend the rest of my time talking to you about, or talking with you. And I want to start by talking about engaging the edges. So if you want to learn, nothing amazing has ever happened without the courage to go to the edge. So think about that for a moment. I would challenge you to think about anything breakthrough in the world that didn't require somebody to go out on the edge and discover something new, right? We think of that as, we call them explorers for a reason. They're going out on the edge. They're going to uncharted territory. They're going to discover something new. And the same thing is true for us. In network theory, we say it's at the intersection of the networks where new things are discovered. It's at these intersections where one group comes together with another group, and at that intersection where the brokers reside, new things are discovered. In sort of the biological world, we call them the tidal pools, right? Think about a tidal pool for a moment. There are more discoveries and more mutations and more emergent life species in the tidal pools than any place else on land, on Earth, if you will. And that happens because of this collision of all these different things and dynamics. And it's fragile, by the way. It's not always a great place to reside, but that's where many things originate. Many things originate on the edges. And that's what I want to spend a little time talking to you about. If you're trying to create breakthrough, you better get outside of your day-to-day. And this is my favorite network diagram. Of all the network diagrams that I've ever created, this is my favorite. This is the savannah, and this is where things can be discovered, right? So you've got the speed of a gazelle, you've got the power of a water buffalo, or the endurance of a zebra, and then you got this guy right here. I think it's a guy. I don't know for sure, but you've got this little sort of explorer, right? You're sort of hanging out in the center, right? That's the Steve Jobs of the world. That is the Steve Jobs network. So the question is, are you going to places to learn new things? Are you staying inside of your own practice? Are you staying inside of your own institution? Because you need to get outside in order to discover. Let me put that in real business context. So here's what we know about the world. What we know about the world is that virtually all of the world's growth is happening inside of urban environments. On an annual basis, the world's population has grown at 1.84%. 1.84%, and all of that is happening inside of urban environments. Fact is, inside of developed countries, About 70% of the current population already lives inside of cities. And I don't know if you've ever driven around inside of a city lately, but it's not necessarily a fun activity, is it? Driving from one place to the other in Manhattan might actually be as much of a burden as a benefit. So that might be a problem if you sell a lot of trucks in the center of the country, right? So we know how to sell trucks. We know how to make trucks. The world's population is migrating to cities. If we continue to focus on selling trucks in rural areas, that might be a problem for us. So what we did was we sent out a group of people using design thinking methodologies. We sent out a group of people to act as brokers to engage the edges and go discover what they could find inside of these urban environments. And what that led to is a new product for General Motors that you probably have heard about. If you haven't, you will, called Maven. And Maven was discovered by going to the edge and engaging in these city environments and better understanding what people needed from a mobility standpoint. And what we found out was that people wanted access over ownership. People actually wanted access to a vehicle, and Lyft and Uber provided some support for that because it could actually get them from point A to point B, but they still wanted to have access and drive their own vehicle. And at times they needed to get outside of the city, and at times they needed to go to Whole Foods and do a grocery run, and Lyft and Uber weren't convenient for that. So we actually created something that we call Maven. Maven is not a ride-sharing platform, it is a car-sharing platform. So reality is, your car right now, you're not using it, correct? I don't think so. I don't know how you would be. Maybe somebody else is, and then it means that it's a more fully deployed asset, but mostly, I bet that your vehicle is sitting in the parking lot right now. That is an undeployed asset that can be fully deployed, just like Airbnb, if you have the right platform. That is where Maven comes in. Within the first year, we scaled Maven across 17 cities because it was resonating with people. And today, you can actually, through Maven Car Share, you can actually put your vehicle into the platform, and your vehicle could be borrowed by other people in this moment that you're not using it, and be a more fully deployed asset. And the reality is that helps to do a lot of different things for the world, but we would have never discovered that if we stayed inside of our little dyad and always thought about things the way we did without first going out to the edge. But that's not enough, remember? Ideas are cheap. I said that before. Ideas are cheap. You've got to bring those ideas into the world. I am a broker, and I have 10 new ideas. I have some friends sitting in the back row that will tell you I have at least 10 ideas every single day. But the reality is, most of those ideas are pretty bad. The reality is, I will do little with most of those ideas. So to bring those ideas into the world, I need to go find a friend. I need to find somebody who I can partner up with who can, first of all, provide some face merit or face validity that this idea isn't crazy and I haven't gone too far out on the edge. The edge is a fine line, right? I mean, you could get too far out there, and that's where finding a friend to bring it back in and ground it in, sort of the business and or the institution's purpose matters a lot. The second thing is, when I have an idea, my first inclination is to go find a leader. My first inclination is to get my idea formally adopted. Maybe I'll share it with the professor. Maybe I'll share it with the managing director. That's my first inclination. The reality is that's the dumbest thing in the world to do. I'm laying it out there. Like, leaders say no a lot. Leaders are predisposed to saying no a lot. The reason is because they've got a lot of priorities and they get lots of ideas. So a far better strategy is to go find a friend and to play with that idea, to build that idea up. And what we know is that friends help make our ideas contagious. Friends help make our ideas contagious. Friends are how we get ideas adopted, and that's where you need to find somebody to be able to help develop that idea. So all great development happens locally. So ideas out in the open space aren't enough. You've got to bring them into the world. You've got to bring them into the physical reality of manifestation of a product or service or solution, and that happens locally. That happens in small groups. And let me just ask the question, do you know this person? What did he do? What did he invent? I don't have his network, by the way. I wish I did. I wish I had his network. I'm going to make an assertion about his network. But what did he invent? I gave you the answer. It's morning still. The light bulb, right? Thomas Edison, and he invented the light bulb, amongst many other things. Reality is, in about an 8-year time frame, there were 400 patents filed at Menlo Park Laboratories. It was actually called the Invention Factory, and he was called the Wizard of Menlo. And in fact, all of his name was on all 400 patents, but I bet you haven't heard of these guys, and they were all guys. Have you heard of them, the Muckers? The Muckers was a small band of friends, that worked inside of Menlo Laboratories across that 8-year duration, a very small group of people that actually took ideas, many of them coming from Edison, because Edison actually played a broker at many points in time in his life, and brought those ideas into a lab where they could tinker, experiment, explore, iterate, and build and reconfigure. And we all know 10,000 filaments for the light bulb. It was actually 3,000, and it was actually Charles Batch that tested those 3,000. It wasn't Edison himself, and Charlie Batch actually tested those and came up with the right filament that would work and stand up as a commercial success for 1,200 hours at a given point in time. That happens through rapid iteration. That happens through friends working with other friends, bringing ideas into the world. Amazon calls those 2 pizza teams. Small 2 pizza teams, small groups of people, 4 to 6 people that are actually bringing ideas into the world, iterating on them. This is the magic of Amazon, by the way. They don't talk about this a whole lot, but this is the magic of Amazon. Amazon knows that if you want to invent stuff, you do it in small groups. If you want to create something new, you don't do that at large scale across the broad organization. You do it in a bunch of small 2 pizza teams, and they do it with one purpose in mind. And then as soon as they accomplish that purpose, just like Thomas Edison's Muckers did, they disband that group, and that group goes and works on the next big thing. If you know this, you can actually leverage it to your benefit. So this is the cruise automation. Cruise automation, if you don't know cruise automation is our self-driving technology bet. We will have a commercialized self-driving vehicle on the road next year. You'll see that in 2019. That will be a vehicle without a driver behind the driver's seat. And that happened in about an 18-month time frame. The development of that process, that technology, happened in about 18 months. Turns out that 4 generations of self-driving technology have been created by Cruise Automation out in San Francisco, which we own. And 18 months, 4 generations of self-driving technology. It takes us 4 years to design a vehicle. The reason that it worked here so much more quickly is because of these small 2 pizza teams that you see on the right-hand side. Many, many small teams are working on many different parts of an algorithm, and some of them may be working on the maps, some of them may be working on the geosensing technologies, some of them may be working on sensor technologies and cameras or LiDAR systems, and each of those small pockets, that at that point in time was 150 people, were all working on small parts of the algorithm. As that, 1.5 terabytes of data comes in every single day from a vehicle, it's plugged into the bat, these folks go to work, like 2 pizza teams in Amazon, on their small piece, and then it's synchronized at the end so that the pieces work well together through the syncing mechanism in the center. This is how innovation happens today. Speed matters a lot, and that happens through small groups of friends working on a core part of an overall, solution, if you will. And it can happen, if you think about this in a nonprofit, a couple people working on a campaign and a couple other people going out and doing the development part of that campaign and a couple other people doing the solution side of that will happen much more rapidly than if you actually have everybody working on everything. Why? Because there's no shifting cost. And why? Because 2 or 3 people working together knows really intimately how they complement one another, just like the Muckers did. That's how innovation is happening. If you want to do it fast, this configuration works 10 times faster than the more traditional development model. So find a friend is the short answer. If you want to bring something into the world and you want to do it quickly, go find a friend and then go find another friend to be able to help you bring that into the world and build a prototype, build the solution, and then ultimately go test it. And to do that, you need to use the third principle that I want to talk about, which is follow the energy. And follow the energy is basically now 2 or 3 of us have an idea, now maybe even 4 of us have an idea, but does the rest of the world view that idea as valuable? And you can tell a lot by watching people, right? When you share something, you can tell a lot by watching people. And what you really want to do is you want to start shopping that idea around. Shopping it around your ecosystem, your network, your funding network, if you will. If you're a student, other students, and start shopping it around and seeing how they respond to it. Because sometimes ideas are bad, and sometimes they're not. And what you're trying to do is build social proof for that idea. So let me skip forward a couple. What's this? Anyone know? What is this? Where did I pull this from? An Apple campaign. What is Apple doing here? So they're showing something that it's cool, right? So it's cool. This is actually an iPod. Before we had iPhones, for some of you who are a little younger, we used to actually have these devices that would only have music on them. That was it. And they had these clunky sort of navigation systems on it. But whenever this first came out in 2001, this was a campaign ad from Apple. What is Apple trying to do here? I'm trying to get to a very specific point. All your friends are doing it. They're trying to make it cool. They're trying to make it cool. So they're creating these cool little commercials. Here's the most important part that I want to highlight to you. Here's one of the things, those clever people at Apple, I almost cursed. I never curse. They knew that this device was going to be inside your pocket, right? They also knew that black headphones were all over the world. So what did they do? They made them white. Why did they make them white? Because that was the only part that you could actually see, and that was the part that made you cool. What they were doing was creating social proof that having an iPod in your pocket made you really, really cool. And the way you knew you had one of those is because those were white. Now, does that stink? It actually makes me mad when I think about it today. But the reality is they were following the energy. They were creating small bursts of, sort of coolness, if you will, and other people were seeing these things, and they were recognizing that this was cool, and they used that to actually amp up their overall product. And they've been doing that over and over again in the way that they think about marketing. The same thing is true if you're thinking about a campaign in a nonprofit. How do you make it cool? How do you have other people, friends, buy in, and how do you follow the energy? How do you create social proof? How do you make it cool to be at this fundraiser because someone else really, really cool is going to be there? That's the same phenomenon that I'm talking about. Build energy, follow energy. It could equally go the other way, by the way. This is a story that many of us don't know, and what we don't know is that the lack of energy could also tell you a whole lot. So this was Biz Stone, who was one of the core founders of Twitter, and at that point in time, Evan Williams was running a company called Odeo. Anyone ever hear of Odeo? Anyone? Of course not, because they never did anything. But they were a small company that Evan Williams was running at that point in time. They were actually an iPod company, and they basically would curate iPods, or podcasts is what I'm trying to say. They would actually curate podcasts to be pushed out onto your iPod. And Evan Williams noticed something one day. His own employees weren't even using their tools. He noticed that the very own employees actually thought that their product sucked. And he basically literally called a recess one day. Literally realized that they're bleeding funding. They can't keep this thing moving. They're not getting any buzz in the marketplace. So they literally called a recess, and he says, I want you in small teams of 2 or 3 to go out in, I want you to go hack away our product. I want you to hack it, I want you to break it, and I want you to reinvent what we should do. Sitting on a sliding board, no kidding, sitting on a sliding board was Biz Stone, and he actually came up with the working case for Twitter. As a result of, we have a product that no one likes, so let's go and reinvent it. So you could also follow the lack of energy, or notice the lack of energy and go create energy, and it matters a lot because energy flows across an organization. And it turns out that a good idea is only part of it. Finding an idea, building that idea, and then presenting that idea and/or concept is only part of it. you've got to engage the other person. You've got to make sure that they're interested in it in such a way that they get buzzed up. And what we know is that passion spreads informally. Regardless of what change efforts, regardless of what formal campaigns you put in place, the way energy spreads, the way passion spreads is informal, person to person. It happens person to person. And if you know that, right away, you know a few things about how to make change happen, how to make agility happen inside of an organization. This is a real network of how energy clusters on the network. The blue dots are energized cells. The red dots are de-energized cells. And what you notice right away is that pockets of light cluster with each other. And the simple advice that I'll provide to you, more than anything else I'll say today, is avoid the energy vampires, those red pockets, because they will suck the life out of you, even if you don't know it, even if you don't realize it. They will suck the life out of you, and find the positive pockets. If you want to get your idea adopted, the worst thing to do early on, now conflict matters later, and I'm going to be a hypocrite in just a second about this, but I'll tell you why. Conflict matters later, but early on, before that idea has taken off and has gotten energized across the system, the worst thing to do is to take it to the naysayers, because they will kill it and it will suffer a premature death. One of the reasons I tell you to avoid leaders is because leaders are more predisposed to being de-energizers than energizers. Now, that may not be true in every organization, but across organizations, that is generally true. So find the positive pockets. Here's the brutal truth. If somebody who you interact with is criticizing somebody who's not with you in your little pocket at that point in time, like they're bad-mouthing them, they're criticizing them, what do you think they're doing when you're not around? About you? Likewise, if someone is buzzing someone else up, if someone is, bragging on someone is amping them up, what do you think they're doing when you're not there? Now, I know that this isn't a one-for-one, but the reality is, negativity kills. Negativity drags everybody down, and it has a dampening effect. Fourfold is the actual answer, fourfold. It will pull you down fourfold if you hang in a de-energized crowd. So go find the energizers, find those positive pockets, and leverage them. So this is some General Motors data. We actually mapped out energy inside of a network, 750 people. You can't see all these dots, but there were 750 people. And just by using some of the simple math algorithms, I took 2 people. That was it, just 2. And these 2 people were informal leaders. They weren't even formal leaders. They're in the center of the network. And I used this algorithm to light up their energy effect inside the network. Turns out that 2 people light up 23% of a 750-person network. That's just 2 people who aren't even formal leaders. If you can find your energizers, if you can find those positive pockets, you can get your ideas ignited in a whole different way. And that includes outside of organizations. If you can find your high energy development pockets, you can get funding and you can get it amplified, and the network starts to do the work for you, is the point. Same thing true for if you're looking for a job. If you can get people buzzed up and you're hanging out with people that are in a positive network, the chances of them buzzing you up and advocating for you when you're not around, they close your network for you, will get you noticed. Your network talks about you, by the way. It's just, the question is just, what are they saying? And based on who they are, you've got a pretty good understanding of what they're saying when you're not there. So this is serious business, and it will make you successful or not, depending on the way you're thinking about your network. Cool? By the way, if you want to make that happen inside of an organization, if you invite only energizers into a room like this, if you actually know who those energizers are and you invite them in, we do this through something we call tipping forward. You invite only the believers, the people that are actually the positive people, into a room like this. They will amp up your ideas and pick them up, and what they become are carriers of ideas across an organization. And if you can seed your network with energizers, somebody can get up on stage like this and present an idea, and the chances of somebody in the network or auditorium grabbing it and sharing it externally, outwardly, is much, much greater. 3x is the number. So vampires suck the life out of you at a 4x level. Energizers lift up other people's ideas at a 3x level. And this stuff matters tremendously. This is why I believe we will be talking about energy versus engagement inside of corporations at a very near period in time. And by the way, if you want to understand a corporation that did that brilliantly, just look at DaVita. You know, DaVita is, for those of you that don't know DaVita as an organization, it's a dialysis company. There perhaps could be nothing more grim in reality to be in this business. This business sucks, literally. I mean, there's no other way to put it. You know, I think the number is 1 out of 4 dialysis patients, you know, live about a year. That's it. You know, and that's what they're running. But this is their annual meeting. You know, it doesn't look like, you know, a healthcare dialysis facility. This company went on the verge of being bankrupt to being one of the world's most admired brands perpetually, based on just amping up the energy inside the organization and finding energizers and hiring energizers in such a way that people believe passionately with great conviction about what they do. That's why this stuff matters. That's why it's so critical. Now, I did say I would be a hypocrite, right? I did say that at some point conflict matters. And here's when conflict matters. Conflict matters after that idea has been buzzed up and amped down across the organization. Conflict helps to pressure test an idea. Late stage, conflict actually helps to take that idea and disrupt the status quo to get a new idea ushered in. Conflict actually helps to say, why are we in the physical DVD business when in fact we should be streaming content live? It's conflict. That takes conflict. You know, if you have an absence of conflict, you will never disrupt yourself. You will never break down the status quo. And what we know is conflict helps to usher in new solutions at a broad level. And, you know, there is lots of research out there on this, but I'll tell a story. I'll tell one of my favorite stories. I retrospectively went back and studied Walt Disney. And, you know, Walt Disney had a vision, you know, and this was after he was successful with, you know, Mickey Mouse and animation characters, but he had a different vision. His vision was he wanted to create a full-length animation movie. We now know that it's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Anyone know what the response was when Disney had this vision in 1934? Anyone know what the response was? Even his own wife was against him. Even his wife, Lily, said, you know, Walt, I think you maybe should reconsider this. His brother, who managed the finances, was outraged by the whole thing. His brother was just screaming and raging against him. In 2000, so I'll fast forward and then go backwards. In 1937, you know, after 3 or 4 years of production, 1937, Radio Music Hall in Los Angeles, California, you know, a premiere event like this, you know, was the first full-length, you know, reveal of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. At the end of it, you know, Disney had invested his entire life in this, you know, of the last 3 years, and his life's funding, and then some, went into debt. At the end of it, you know, at the end of this movie, you know, Disney's sitting in the front center row, and the theater is dead silent. You know, I'm sure, and he described this later in his memoirs, that it felt like an eternity as the room was completely silent, and he had these thoughts: this is my doom. This was my doom. And then in just about a moment later, everyone jumped up on their feet and started standing and screaming, you know, in hysteria about the sheer brilliance that they just saw on stage. And the headlines rode next day, Walt Disney creates sheer brilliance. Just 2 days before that, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was called Disney's Folly. You know, in a different ad, Disney's Folly. So how did Walt Disney overcome that conflict? How did he overcome that conflict? This story synthesizes everything that I've said so far. How did he do it? First of all, he went to the edge and he had a vision. He had a vision that, in fact, animation wasn't only for 10-minute cartoons. Animation could be emotional. Animation could be dramatic. Animation could draw you in. Animation could be something that would be incredibly compelling, and even an adult would enjoy animation. That's the first thing. That's an edge. Then he, on a stage, much like this one, on a dark stage, in 3 years prior to, you know, the release of the film, in 1934, Disney brought in his core team of folks. So it wasn't a whole auditorium, but, you know, his core team of animators. He came up on stage and he physically worked out, acting out every single character in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, physically on stage himself, 2 hours, dark, silent, while people were listening. What was he trying to do? He was getting his friends to buy into his vision. He was getting his handful of friends who he trusted to actually become compelled. He was trying to build energy inside the system. The rest of the next 3 years was a journey of really Walt Disney using his network to catapult this movie, to the level, to the success that it actually, reached. And he did lots of little tricks. One of the things he did was the characters were jerky. The characters were animation characters, and his animators didn't know how to draw real-life figures, so he brought in ballerinas and literally had ballerinas dancing across the stage and had his animators drawing what those dance movements looked like so he could make the characters more real. He actually created gags. He created challenges. He tried to do some conflict, some competitions with each other, and one of the gags was if you could actually surprise one of the other animators with a personality trait or characteristic of one of the dwarfs so that they were all 7 very, very unique personalities, he would pay you $5. He would give you a bonus of $5. So all these little things in priming his network ultimately ramped up to become the success of Snow White. And that's where conflict matters. Conflict matters at the end because you need to make sure that you're actually listening to what people are saying so that you can respond to it. Perhaps the most brilliant person today at being able to do this is Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos says, you can't have breakthrough without something to break through. So if there's no conflict, we know that we're not going to do anything provocative. The way I like to think about it is conflict is a compliment. If you're trying to be disruptive, conflict is a compliment. If no one resists my idea, then it must not be very bold. And that's why conflict matters, and that's how you engage in conflict in the end. And I'll share this one last story before I share the last principle and finish up here. I like to use this analogy. Does anyone know what kind of airspeed or land speed a Boeing 747 needs for liftoff? Anyone know? Any aeronautical engineer? I always have to ask this question because I'm always afraid that somebody's going to actually shred apart my theory. But go ahead. 300 miles per hour. The answer is they need 180 miles per hour land speed to get liftoff for a Boeing 747. So conventional wisdom would say this: if the wind is blowing, I want the tailwind to lift me off sooner, right? No. Turns out that if the tailwind doesn't help at all, if I fly into a headwind of 30 miles per hour, I get airspeed liftoff of 150 miles per hour. That's what conflict does. If you want liftoff sooner, later in the stage, now you have to have a Boeing 747 that's functionally sound enough to actually stand up against the resistance. But if you want liftoff sooner, charge into the conflict, listen to the people around you, pivot, respond to it, and then you get liftoff sooner, just like Disney did. Disney didn't ignore it. Disney soaked it all in. And Walt Disney actually then absorbed it and used it to his benefit to create energy with his animators. And so, in short, if you want to actually make change happen, let me talk about the last principle and then I'll finish up. In short, the final thing you want to do is you want to close the network in on formal leaders. The final thing you want to do is you want to create network closure on the decision makers. So this is where leadership matters immensely. This is where sponsors and funders and professors for students matter a lot, right? Up until now, you're bringing a new idea into the world. You're playing with friends to get it energized. You're dealing with some of the conflict that you get from feedback, like Twitter did, and then ultimately, you're closing your network in on your leader. So if you actually want your leader to buy into something, get your network talking about that something before you ever go talk to them. So if you want to get an idea developed, get your network energized about it, and chances are they're already talking about it before you go make the pitch. Guess what? Half the battle's already won. Your reputation already exists because somebody knows you for that idea, and your network's already talking about it. So what we know about most business decisions are they're about 80% emotional. So the studies say that 80% of business decisions are emotional. We make those decisions in the first 30 seconds, and then we look for substantiating objective facts to validate the decision that we emotionally want to make. And only if those facts are lousy might we reverse our emotional decision. Behavioral economists have shown, and some of you in the room probably know this better than I do, that about 80% of our decisions are irrational and emotional. And we then use objective facts and maybe even distortion to support our case. And if you can actually leverage that to your benefit, you can get people to buy into your ideas sooner. So at the end of the day, if you want to make a difference inside of a large company, if you want to make a difference inside of your ecosystem, if you want to make a difference inside of your small little community, what you've got to do is you first, just to do something different and think differently, you've got to go to the edge. You then have to go find a few friends to work with that idea to bring it into the world so it's a physical manifestation of something, service or solution. You then have to leverage energy inside your network to get it amped up. Deal with the conflict then and only then, and then ultimately what happens is you close your network in on core decision makers to disrupt the status quo. That's what adaptive space is. And if you think about change this way, and you think about agility this way, what ends up happening is you can disrupt yourself before being disrupted.